I still remember the exact moment it happened, the kind of moment that doesn't shout or explode but quietly rewrites everything you thought you knew about your own family. And it began with a single sentence spoken into a microphone on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Let's take a moment to thank the real providers of this beautiful wedding, because not everyone here earned their place. The room filled with polite laughter, glasses clinking softly under the warm glow of string lights, and I felt every eye shift without anyone quite daring to look directly at me. I sat there in my pale blue dress, hands folded neatly in my lap, my smile steady, controlled, the kind of smile you learn after decades of swallowing words you wish you could say out loud. And I didn't need anyone to explain it to me. I knew exactly who that sentence was meant for, my father, the man who spent 37 years working double shifts at a steel plant, just so I could stand in that ballroom in a dress he had quietly paid for without ever asking for recognition. The man who sat 2 tables away in a modest gray suit that suddenly looked too simple under the chandeliers, as if dignity could somehow be measured in fabric and price tags. I watched him lower his eyes for just a second before straightening his shoulders, pretending not to notice, pretending it hadn't touched him. And that was when I understood this wasn't a careless joke or a poorly worded speech. This was intentional, designed, placed carefully like a knife wrapped in silk. And when I lifted my gaze, I caught Sophie's reflection in the mirrored wall behind the bar, her lips curved in that soft, satisfied smile she wore when everything was going exactly according to her plan. Daniel stood beside her, nodding faintly, not laughing, not objecting, just allowing it. And in that moment something inside me didn't break. It didn't shatter the way you might expect. It simply went still, cold, precise. Like a door quietly closing, I reached for my glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it back down without a sound. Around me the music resumed. Conversations picked up again, waiters moved gracefully between tables as if nothing had shifted, but I could feel it, the subtle change in the air, the invisible line that had just been drawn, and I realized something else too, something even more important than the insult itself. They thought I would stay silent because I always had. They thought I would smile and let it pass because that was the role I had played for years, the accommodating mother, the grateful guest in my own family's life. But they didn't understand one simple thing: silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it just means you're choosing the exact right moment to speak. And as I sat there, listening to the soft hum of celebration around me, I already knew that before this night was over, I was going to say something that none of them would ever forget. There had been a time when none of this would have felt possible, when a day like this would have been built on something simple and unquestioned. And as the evening continued around me, I found my thoughts drifting backward, not in a way that pulled me out of the present, but in a way that sharpened it, because I could see so clearly now what this day was supposed to represent and what it had quietly become. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table almost a year ago with a stack of fabric, samples spread out in front of me, while Olivia leaned over my shoulder, her excitement filling the room as she talked about colors and flowers and the kind of music she wanted playing as she walked down the aisle. And I remembered how my father had stood in the doorway that afternoon, listening more than speaking, his hands folded loosely in front of him as he nodded along, offering small suggestions only when asked, never once trying to take control, but always ready to support whatever would make her happy. And when the conversation turned to budgets and numbers that felt just slightly out of reach, he had been the one who quietly stepped forward, clearing his throat in that familiar way before saying that we should not worry about it, that some moments in life deserve to be done right. And I had seen the way Olivia's eyes lit up, the way relief and gratitude softened her expression, and I had told myself then that this day would be different, that it would be a reflection of everything he had worked for, everything he had given without ever asking for recognition. And yet somewhere along the way that understanding had been reshaped, piece by piece, decision by decision, until the story being told tonight barely resembled the truth at all. I thought about the planning meetings that had slowly shifted away from my kitchen and into private conversations I was not included in, the vendor calls that I heard about only after they were finalized, the seating chart that had been revised more times than anyone could reasonably explain, and each time I had been given a reason that sounded logical on its own, a small adjustment here, a necessary change there, nothing significant enough to challenge on its own. But now, looking at the full picture, I could see the pattern that had been forming all along, the careful repositioning of roles, the quiet diminishing of certain contributions while others were elevated and displayed. And it struck me then that this had never been about the wedding itself. Not really. It had been about ownership, about control over how the story would be told and who would be credited for it. And as I sat there listening to the soft murmur of conversation rise and fall around me, I realized that the version of events being presented tonight was not just incomplete. It was deliberately rewritten, and the only reason it had worked for as long as it did was because I had allowed it to, because I had trusted that respect would naturally follow where it was deserved. And now, watching the evening unfold exactly as planned, I understood that respect is not something that quietly maintains itself. It is something that can be removed just as easily as it is given. And once it is taken, the absence is unmistakable. And for the first time since the night began, I felt something steady and certain settle beneath the surface of my calm. Not anger, not regret, but clarity. The kind that does not rush or demand attention, the kind that simply waits for the right moment to be seen. I was not the only one who had started to notice, even if most people chose not to say anything out loud, because silence at events like this often has less to do with ignorance and more to do with comfort. And it was during a quiet moment between courses, when the clinking of silverware softened and conversations dipped into lower tones, that someone gently took the empty seat beside me. It was Margaret Hayes, an old family friend who had known my father long before I was born. Her presence steady and familiar in a way that immediately set her apart from the carefully curated energy of the room. She did not begin with small talk or polite observations about the decorations. Instead, she leaned slightly closer and said in a calm, measured voice that carried more weight than volume ever could, "Your father does not deserve that." And for a brief second, I felt something inside me respond, not with surprise, but with recognition, because hearing the truth spoken so simply, without embellishment or hesitation, has a way of cutting through everything else. I turned to her and met her eyes, and there was no judgment there, only clarity, the kind that comes from having lived long enough to recognize patterns without needing them explained. She did not ask me what I was going to do. She did not offer advice or try to soften the situation. She simply placed her hand lightly over mine and added, "Some people mistake kindness for permission," before letting her words settle in the space between us. And in that moment, I realized how carefully I had been navigating this evening, how I had been measuring every reaction, every glance, every silence, not out of fear, but out of habit, a habit formed over years of choosing peace over confrontation, of believing that if I stayed composed long enough, things would correct themselves. But Margaret's words shifted something subtle yet important. They reframed the situation not as a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment, but as a deliberate crossing of a line that had been left unguarded for too long. I glanced once more across the room, toward Sophie, who was now laughing softly with a group of guests, her posture relaxed, confident, as though the narrative she had constructed was firmly in place and beyond challenge. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to see her not just as someone difficult or controlling, but as someone who had carefully built this moment step by step, anticipating that no one would interrupt it, that no one would question it. And I understood then that what I was preparing to do was not simply a response. It was a correction, not loud or dramatic, but precise, intentional, and impossible to dismiss. Margaret gave my hand a small, reassuring squeeze before standing and returning to her table, leaving me alone again, but not in the same way as before, because now there was no uncertainty left, no lingering doubt about whether I was overreacting or reading too much into what had happened. The line had been drawn clearly, acknowledged quietly, and accepted fully, and as the lights shifted slightly and the master of ceremonies stepped forward to announce the next part of the evening, inviting a few select guests to prepare for their speeches, I felt a calm settle over me. That was deeper than anything I had experienced all night, not because the situation had improved, but because I finally understood exactly what needed to be done, and more importantly, exactly how I was going to do it. The next sequence of speeches began with the familiar rhythm of celebration, carefully chosen voices stepping forward one by one to offer their version of love, family, and support. and I listened to each of them with a quiet attentiveness that had nothing to do with the words themselves and everything to do with what was being left unsaid, because omission, I had learned, is often more revealing than exaggeration. A close friend of the groom spoke first, sharing stories filled with laughter and nostalgia, followed by a cousin who described Olivia as kind, generous, and endlessly patient. And while their words were sincere, they floated on the surface of the evening, untouched by the undercurrent that had been building steadily beneath it. And then Daniel's name was called, and the room responded with a warm, expectant applause. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket as he made his way to the stage. His expression composed, but not entirely steady, and for a brief moment, just before he reached the microphone, his eyes found mine, and something flickered there, something uncertain, almost questioning, but it passed quickly, replaced by the familiar calm he had learned to present in public. He began by thanking the guests, the venue, the planning team, his voice measured and practiced, and then he moved into speaking about family, about the people who had supported Olivia throughout her life. And I listened carefully, not because I expected anything different, but because I needed to hear exactly how far the narrative would go. And as his speech continued, I noticed the pattern repeating itself: names mentioned, contributions highlighted, gratitude expressed with careful precision, and yet again, there was an absence so clear it almost had weight. My father's name was not spoken, not once, and it was not an oversight, not after everything that had already happened. It was a continuation, a deliberate reinforcement of the version of events that had been presented all evening, and I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not even disappointment, but confirmation, the final piece of a pattern that no longer needed interpretation. Daniel finished his speech to applause that filled the room, stepping back with a small nod as he returned to his seat beside Sophie, who reached for his hand with a reassuring smile. And I watched them for a moment, not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that stripped away any remaining illusion. They believed this was complete, that the story had been told exactly as intended, that nothing more needed to be said. And perhaps for most people in that room, that would have been true, because what is presented with confidence is often accepted without question. But I knew better now, and more importantly, I knew that what came next would not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. It would only require timing. And as the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone to introduce the final round of remarks, inviting anyone else who wished to share a few words to come forward, I felt the moment arrive quietly, naturally, as if it had been waiting for me all along, and, without hesitation, without drawing attention to myself, I placed my hands on the table, stood up, and began to walk toward the stage. I could feel the subtle shift in the room the moment I stepped into the open space between the tables and the stage. It was not loud or dramatic, just a quiet ripple of attention as conversations softened and a few heads turned in my direction. And by the time I reached the steps leading up to the microphone, the master of ceremonies had already paused, offering me a polite, slightly uncertain smile as if trying to place whether this had been planned or not. I returned the smile gently and took the microphone with steady hands, adjusting it just slightly before looking out across the room. And for a brief moment I said nothing, not because I did not know what to say, but because silence, when used correctly, has a way of gathering every wandering thought back into one place. And I wanted every person in that room to be present for what came next. I let my gaze move slowly from table to table, not searching for anyone in particular, just allowing the weight of the moment to settle naturally. And then I began, my voice calm, even, the kind of tone that does not ask for attention but receives it anyway. I spoke about the day, about how beautiful everything looked, how much care had gone into every detail, and how proud I was of Olivia. And as I spoke, I could feel the room relax again, the tension dissolving just enough for people to believe this was simply another heartfelt addition to the evening. But I did not rush. I did not fill the space with unnecessary emotion. I let each sentence land fully before moving to the next, and then I shifted, gently, almost imperceptibly. I spoke about family, about what it truly means to support someone, not in words, but in actions that often go unnoticed. I spoke about the kind of love that does not need recognition to exist, the kind that shows up early, stays late, and quietly carries the weight of moments like this without ever asking to be seen. And as I said it, I allowed my eyes to settle, just briefly, on my father, who sat exactly where he had been all evening, his posture unchanged, his expression steady. And then I looked back at the room, and I could feel it again, that subtle tightening in the air, the sense that something was being said without being said directly. And I knew they were listening now, not just hearing the words, but trying to understand where they were leading. I paused once more, letting the silence return, and in that space, I could see Sophie's smile begin to falter, just slightly. The first crack in the composure she had maintained so carefully all evening. Daniel shifted in his seat, his attention fixed on me now in a way it had not been before, and I realized then that the moment had arrived exactly as I had expected, not forced, not rushed, but earned through everything that had come before. And as I tightened my grip on the microphone just enough to steady my breath, I prepared to say the one thing that would change the direction of the entire night without ever raising my voice. And then I said it, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough that every person in that room could hear each word exactly as it was meant to be heard. I said that before the night went any further, there was one thing I needed to correct, just one small detail that had somehow been overlooked throughout the evening. And I let that sentence settle for a moment. Watching his expressions shifted from polite attention to quiet curiosity, I continued by saying that weddings are not only about celebrating the future, they are also about honoring the foundation that made that future possible, and that sometimes, in the effort to make everything look perfect, the truth can become edited. I chose that word carefully, and I could feel the reaction ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. And then I turned slightly, just enough for my gaze to find my father again, and I said his name, Robert Carter, slowly, deliberately, allowing it to carry across the room in a way that no one could ignore or misplace. I spoke about the years he spent working before sunrise and returning long after sunset, about the choices he made quietly so that moments like this could exist at all, and I did not exaggerate or embellish. I simply stated what had always been true, that this wedding, every light, every flower, every carefully arranged detail, stood on the shoulders of a man who never asked to be recognized. And I paused there, just long enough for the weight of that truth to settle into the silence that had taken over the room. And then I added the part that changed everything. I said that earlier this evening, there had been a comment about who had earned their place here, and I smiled slightly, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that made the words land exactly where they needed to. I said that if earning a place means showing up, sacrificing quietly, and giving without expectation, then there is no one in this room more deserving of that place than my father. And I did not look at Sophie when I said it. I did not need to, because the shift in the air was immediate, unmistakable. Conversations had stopped completely now, the kind of silence that does not come from discomfort alone, but from recognition. And I could feel it, the realization spreading through the room as people began to understand not just what had been said, but what had been implied all along. I adjusted my grip on the microphone slightly, my voice never rising, never wavering, and I finished by saying that respect is not something that can be reassigned or rewritten depending on who is holding the microphone. It exists in the truth of what people have done, whether or not it is acknowledged. And tonight, I wanted to make sure that truth was heard clearly. And when I finally lowered the microphone just a fraction, I did not need to look at anyone to know that the entire room had changed, because sometimes one sentence, spoken at exactly the right moment, does not just interrupt a narrative, it replaces it entirely. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of stillness that does not happen often in a room filled with over 100 people, the kind that feels almost deliberate, as if time itself had paused just long enough for the truth to settle into every corner of the space. I stood there with the microphone still in my hand, not rushing to fill the silence, not trying to soften what had just been said, because there was nothing left to explain. And then, slowly, the room began to respond, not with the loud applause that usually follows a speech at a wedding, but with something quieter, more thoughtful. A few guests nodded to one another, others shifted in their seats, glancing toward my father in a way they had not done before, as if seeing him for the first time in the full context of what had just been revealed. I turned my head slightly and saw him still seated at his table, his hands resting calmly in front of him. But there was something different now, something subtle but unmistakable in the way he held himself, a quiet acknowledgement that he had been seen, not because he asked for it, but because it had finally been given. And then I looked toward Sophie, and for the first time that evening, she did not look composed. Her smile had faded, replaced by a stillness that felt less like control and more like calculation, as if she were trying to determine how much of what I had said could be undone, how much of the narrative she had built could still be held together. Daniel sat beside her, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, and I could see it now, the realization settling in, not just about the moment, but about everything that had led up to it. Because once a pattern is made visible, it becomes impossible to ignore. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat softly, stepping forward as if to regain control of the program, offering a polite thank you, and suggesting that we continue with the evening. But the energy had shifted too much for things to simply return to what they had been. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more deliberate, and I could feel the change in the way people looked at one another, the way they reconsidered what they had heard earlier in the night, weighing it against what had just been said. And I understood then that this was the real impact, not a dramatic reaction or a loud confrontation, but a subtle, irreversible shift in perception, the kind that cannot be corrected with another speech or another carefully chosen phrase. I placed the microphone back in its stand with steady hands and stepped away from the stage, not looking back, not waiting for a response, because there was nothing left to gain from staying there. The truth had already done its work, and as I walked back through the room, I noticed the small details that confirmed it. The guest who stepped slightly aside to let me pass with a quiet nod, the way the space itself seemed to open rather than close. And when I returned to my seat, I did not sit immediately. Instead, I turned once more toward my father, meeting his eyes across the room. And in that brief exchange, without a single word spoken, I knew that everything that needed to be restored had already been set back into place. The evening did not collapse after that moment. It did not descend into chaos or confrontation the way people might expect when something uncomfortable is brought into the open. Instead, it continued, but not in the same way. The music resumed, glasses were raised again, and conversations picked up where they had left off. Yet everything carried a different weight now, as if the room itself had been quietly rearranged into something more honest. I took my seat slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress with a calm that felt earned rather than performed. And for a few minutes I allowed myself to simply exist within the space I had just shifted, not searching for reactions, not measuring the impact, because I already understood that what mattered most had already been set in motion. Daniel approached first, not immediately, but after enough time had passed for him to gather himself, his steps measured, his expression controlled in the way that suggested he was still deciding which version of this moment he wanted to present. He stopped just beside me, close enough that his voice did not need to rise above the music, and for a second he said nothing, as if expecting me to fill the silence for him the way I had so many times before. But I did not. I simply looked at him, waiting, and eventually he spoke, saying that it had not been meant the way it sounded, that things had been misunderstood. The familiar language of soft correction, of trying to reshape what had already been made clear. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I no longer felt the need to argue. And when he finished, I responded quietly, telling him that intent does not erase impact, and that silence, when repeated often enough, becomes its own kind of agreement. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated it the way one states something that no longer requires debate. He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see the shift happening. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real, the kind of shift that begins when someone is finally confronted with a version of the truth they cannot easily dismiss. He nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something he had not been ready to see before, and then he stepped back, not with resolution, but with the understanding that this conversation was not going to unfold the way he expected. Sophie did not come over. She remained where she was, engaged in conversation that looked carefully normal from a distance, but I could tell by the way her posture held just a little too still that she was aware of everything that had changed, and that she was choosing, at least for now, not to challenge it directly. And that choice, that restraint, told me more than any confrontation could have, because it meant she understood the shift as well as I did. And as the evening continued to move forward, guided by schedules and traditions that no longer held quite the same authority. I realized something simple and final: I had not taken anything from them. I had not ruined the evening or disrupted the celebration. I had only removed the version of the story that did not belong. And in doing so, I had left behind something far more difficult to ignore: the truth, steady, unembellished, and now impossible to replace. As the evening unfolded, I noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Not a dramatic change, but a quiet recalibration, as though the entire room was adjusting to something unspoken that had taken place. And I sat there for a while, observing, feeling the weight of everything that had been said and done, not needing to fill the space with words, just letting the silence settle in its own time. Because in moments like this, silence speaks louder than any declaration could. I watched as people began to engage with one another again. But there was something different now, a deeper awareness in their voices, a careful consideration in their words, as if they were all searching for something they hadn't noticed before, or perhaps realizing that the story they had been told all evening was not the whole truth. And as I sat there, I felt the smallest shift inside me too: a release, a deep sense of quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I had not just spoken the truth, but had allowed others the space to hear it, without rushing, without forcing, and without expecting anything in return. And then, across the room, I saw Daniel once more, and this time, he wasn't looking at me with uncertainty, but with something else, something that wasn't entirely resolved but was different from before: a quiet understanding, the kind that comes when someone is no longer sure of the story they've been living by. And for the first time in hours, he took a step toward me, slow and deliberate, and I saw Sophie shift in her seat as well, her gaze following him, but she didn't move, not immediately. And I wondered, for the briefest moment, whether she would choose to address what had happened, or whether she would hold to the carefully crafted narrative she had spent so long constructing. And as Daniel reached my side, he didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at me as if he needed a moment to process what had been shared. And after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice low, but steady. I didn't realize how much we'd changed, and for a moment, I could see the conflict in his eyes, the recognition that something had gone wrong, but also the reluctance to fully confront it. And without speaking further, I simply nodded, offering him the space to process. And he stood there for a moment longer, before quietly returning to his seat. And as I watched him, I knew that this moment, this quiet understanding, was the first step in unraveling something far deeper than any one conversation could address. But it was enough for now, because sometimes, knowing that a change has begun is all you really need. And as I looked back toward the stage, the weight of the night felt a little lighter, a little more resolute, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find its way to the surface. As the evening drew to a close, there was an unmistakable shift in the energy of the room, like the last note of a song hanging in the air, just long enough to linger in everyone's memory before it faded away completely. And as the guests slowly gathered their coats and began to prepare to leave, there was no longer the same sense of haste or bustle that usually accompanies the end of such an event. People moved with purpose, but with a gentleness that hadn't been there earlier. Conversations had softened, the laughter that filled the room now carrying a different tone, as if they were all considering the moments that had unfolded, rethinking pieces of a story they thought they knew. I stayed seated for a while longer, watching the quiet exodus, not in a hurry to leave, but not feeling the need to stay either. I knew that I had already done what I came here to do, that the truth had been heard, and that whatever changes it had set in motion would unfold in their own time. I looked across the room one last time, meeting my father's gaze as he slowly stood and made his way toward me, his movements slow, deliberate, but not heavy. And for the first time that evening, I saw his shoulders relax, the tension that had carried through the night finally easing. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, and I could see the emotion in his eyes, something that hadn't been there earlier, something deeper than gratitude, something that carried the weight of years lived in quiet, unrecognized sacrifice. "Thank you," he said simply, and it was enough. It was more than enough. I nodded, not needing to say anything in return, because in that one moment, everything that had been left unsaid for so long had been acknowledged. And then, with a shared understanding, we walked out of the room together, the evening coming to its natural end, but the weight of its meaning still settling within us. Outside, the night was crisp, the air cool against our skin as we stood in the parking lot, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with the world around me and everything to do with what had just been shared. It was quiet now, just the sound of our footsteps on the pavement, and I realized that sometimes the most profound moments come not in grand gestures, but in the stillness that follows them, in the recognition that, finally, the truth has been heard, and that, for the first time in a long while, everything is